Greetings again. Today we're in chapter 37 of Genesis, and it's the second part. Let's pick the story up at verse 12 here. This is the Joseph narrative. Now his brothers had gone to graze their father's flocks near Shechem, and Israel said to Joseph, "As you know, your brothers are grazing their flocks near Shechem. Come, I am going to send you to them." "Very well," he replied. So he said to him, "Go and see if all is well with your brothers and with the flocks, and bring word back to me." Then he sent him off from the valley of Hebron. When Joseph arrived at Shechem, a man found him wandering around the fields and asked him, "What are you looking for?" He replied, "I'm looking for my brothers. Can you tell me where they are grazing their flocks?" "They've moved on from here," the man answered. "I heard them say, 'Let's go to Dothan.'" So Joseph went after his brothers and found them near Dothan. But they saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. "Here comes that dreamer," they said to each other. "Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams." When Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue him from their hands. "Let's not take his life," he said. "Don't shed any blood. Throw him into this cistern here in the desert. But don't lay a hand on him." Reuben said this to rescue him from them and take him back to his father. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the richly ornamented robe he was wearing. And they took him and threw him into the cistern. Now the cistern was empty, there was no water in it. As they sat down to eat their meal, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, "What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hand on him. After all, he's our brother, our own flesh and blood." His brothers agreed. So when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites who took him to Egypt. When Reuben returned to the cistern and saw that Joseph was not there, he tore his clothes. He went back to his brothers and said, "The boy isn't there. Where can I turn now?" Then they got Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, and dipped the robe in blood. They took the ornamented robe back to their father and said, "We found this. Examine and see whether it is your son's robe." He recognized it and said, "It is my son's robe. Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and daughters came to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. "No," he said, "in mourning I will go down to the grave to my son." So his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. Well, that's the story. Well, we've read this story of Joseph, and so we cheat. We know the ending, but it's kind of interesting. Here's some pictures to go with the story. There's Joseph in the pit. Nice pit, don't you think? Nicely formed and nice cozy place out of the wind and weather. And then, of course, there's an artist's conception of the selling of Joseph for 20 pieces of silver. And then he was later sold to Potiphar. And that's probably one of those things where you buy low and sell high. So Jesus was sold for 30 pieces of silver. It would be interesting to know what Potiphar had to pay for this young man. But the story is about the length to which jealousy will go. You know, if we are driven by jealousy or anger or bitterness or some one of those things, it will push us into doing things we never dreamed we would do. I want to go back to the places that are mentioned. I've had the privilege of wandering around over these places, visiting them. Been to Israel 5 times, and so all of these places have significance to me. Hebron's down south, so that's where the cave of Machpelah is, and apparently Jacob had gone back to visit his father and was there before his father died. That was one of his requests of God, and so God had granted him the privilege. So he stays and lives down near Hebron, and we are told that the brothers went up towards Shechem. So that's about 50 miles north of Hebron, and then someone told Joseph that he heard his brothers say they were going on up toward Dothan, so that's another 17 miles. That's 67 miles. Grazing sheep. That would be a slow journey. It would take several days, lots of days, to wander up that far as you grazed your sheep. But we read that Jacob's sons, of course, were herding sheep, but Joseph had been tending the sheep along with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah. Now, those were the servant brides of Joseph, and so the family may have separated into the servant children and the legitimate wives' children. At any rate, Joseph was with the servant wives. Isn't that interesting? So Israel sent Joseph to, I suppose, take a care package to his brothers. Some chocolate chip cookies, some dried figs and dates, and maybe some raisins. Anyway, he went off to the area of Shechem and then was told that the brothers had gone up toward Dothan. And so those are the places that we're reading about. There's an interesting little comment in verse 18 that the brothers saw Joseph in the distance. So there was something distinct. Sometimes there's something distinct about the way a person walks or rides a horse, and you can distinguish at a distance. It may have been Joseph's clothes, his coat specifically. But jealousy can be a vicious driver, and so we read that they plotted to kill him and then decided to throw him into a cistern, and then the plot evolves from there. The comment, however, that they made was, "We'll see what comes of this dreamer." And, of course, his dreams. Now, there's just a hint of an anticipation of what God might do. It's probably not conscious, but it's subconscious, and there it is. At any rate, it sets the readers up, those of us that come along reading the story, for an expectation of what God is going to do in all of this. Now, immediately, the brothers' plans were interrupted by Reuben, the oldest, and he suggested they not kill him, and we're told that his plan was to come back some other time and rescue Joseph and take him back to his father. It's interesting, however, that in all of this, they are going to lie about Joseph's death. Well, we found this robe. Do you recognize it? Yeah, but it's a lie. Jacob himself had been a deceiver, and his kids had grown up, been born to his family while he was a deceiver, and so they probably, they're chips off the old block. They say that an apple doesn't fall far from the tree, and so on. Judah also plays a role in sparing Joseph's life, even though he suggested they sell him off into a foreign land. But in all of this story, what we're going to learn is that God doesn't lose control because his people do bad things. So Moses includes these details to show how God works his plan through the influences and the situations and the circumstances and the wrongdoings, even of the covenant people. There's a reference here to Joseph's coat. Now, of course, Jacob, or he's called Israel now, had favoritism, and it's evidenced by the special gift of a unique coat that he gave to Joseph. The King James Version used to translate it a coat of many colors, and so I have come to know it as in that sense. And always, when I think of it, I have a tendency to think of it as a multicolored coat. But other versions more recently have translated a coat with sleeves. At this point, scholars have come to understand that it was a long garment. In other words, it had sleeves and it also extended down to the feet. So it was long in two senses, long in the arms and long in the legs. But whatever it was distinct, and naturally on seeing it, it fanned the flame of jealousy in the brothers. It may explain, though, how the brothers recognized him at a distance. What we're seeing in this, that the symbol of preference becomes a means of recognition, and then, of course, recognition specifically of the loss. There is mention in this passage about Ishmaelites, Midianites, and Medanites. Now, those names float through Genesis here, so a reference later to the Midianites is in Judges, where Gideon is involved, and it talks about the camp of Midian. So the Midianites float up in the book of Judges. A little later in Judges, it speaks of both Midianites and Amalekites. Amalekites become a symbol of the sinful nature. And we are, as Saul was commanded to kill off all the Amalekites. In the New Testament, we are told to put to death, therefore, the old man or the sinful nature. Midianites, on the other hand, is specifically a symbol of perverted sexual desires. And so we have these two things that float through the Bible, and it's kind of interesting to stay alert to what they symbolize. In Genesis 37 here, the reference to the group is that they are Medanites, and then later they're called Ishmaelites. The Ishmaelites are sons of Ishmael, the rejected son of Abraham, and it seems to be a broader reference or a broader group that includes Midianites and Medanites, and then of course the larger group is called Ishmaelites. They were desert dwellers who plied the camel trails and traveled carrying spices and silk. So the spice road and the silk road are things that we know about. And it even says in here that they were carrying spices down to Egypt. So they were on their way to Egypt. These camel trains sometimes were 100 camels long, and they actually carried a militia along with them to fend off the thieves along the way. There's a prophetic picture in all of this. So what happens to Joseph seems to foreshadow what will happen to the entire nation of Israel, all the descendants of Israel. So eventually we're going to read how the whole family is carried down to Egypt, and the presenting cause is, of course, a famine. But while in Egypt, they'll first of all become very comfortable and then eventually become slaves. Now, that is a picture of how sin attracts us, and we have a tendency to become sinners in some specific way, like a vice, and then we become enslaved to it, enslaved to sin, and we cannot deliver ourselves from that. But Jacob comments here at the end of the chapter, "In mourning will I go down." The Hebrew word ered, down, is kind of a play on words there, to the grave, Sheol. So, down to the grave. Well, he went down to Egypt, which was kind of a grave because he died there. But it's kind of a grave in that the abundant life is stolen from the children of Israel, or they are deprived of the kind of life that God would have intended for them to have. And they're down there because of their own sin. We talk about how he who lives by the sword dies by the sword, or what you do unto others will be done to you, and so on. These kind of principles float through this story. Ironically, the Joseph narrative concludes with Jacob actually going down to Egypt to see his son, and then that's where he died. He did go down to the grave. Sheol is sometimes translated hell, but the concept in Hebrew of hell is simply the grave. It's not the end of existence, but it is a kind of underground existence, but not life. Anyway, that's the passage that we have in the second part of chapter 37. And we'll continue these Joseph passages a little bit. And of course, you know, it's an awesome story. It's got the tragic and it's got the absolutely wonderful in it. And Joseph becomes a type of Christ. And you can see immediately the selling for pieces of silver and the betrayal by his own people and all of those things figure into exactly what happens to Jesus, the Messiah, that happened to Joseph. But Joseph, while it might look like he's the one that's going to be involved in the messianic lineage, ultimately is not, and we'll wait for a later time to see that. Thanks for joining me today. May God's richest blessing be with you.